Hello, and welcome to Addiction and Recovery. Here, we share stories of hope and strength. Please make sure to hit the subscribe button. Hey guys, welcome to Addiction and Recovery by Wagz Creations. Today's episode 2, we're going to be talking about, or I'm going to be talking about a little backstory of my life and, how I got into addiction and what led me down that path and, eventually what led me to recovery and where I'm at, kind of give you guys a backstory to let you guys know why I qualify and why I deserve to be here. I was born in Denver, Colorado. My dad died at a young age. I was only 2 years old. He committed suicide. My mom had found him on our back porch. He had hung himself. Never really bothered me too much. I didn't really know him. I don't have any memories of him. Obviously I wish he was here. I wish I could ask him some questions and, who wouldn't want their father, but it was kind of all I knew growing up. So it didn't really affect me too much in that sense that I knew about growing up, right after my dad had died, we moved to California, moved to Fresno. I lived here until I was about 5 years old, then eventually moved to Montana. I lived there for about a year, and then moved to North Dakota, Beach, North Dakota, real small town there. Lived there for about a year and a half, 2 years. And then eventually I moved to Montana, Billings, Montana. And then I lived there for about 4 years. And then in about the beginning of sixth grade, I decided to move down here to Fresno. I decided to move away from my mom and move in with my aunt and uncle. I moved around a lot because, my mom's different boyfriends and things like that, which is okay. My mom's free to live her life. I never held that against her or anything like that. And like I said, I always had what I wanted growing up, and I was never without. The only thing I was without is I was alone a lot. That was the only unfortunate part. I remember spending a lot of Christmases alone and things like that. And, I'd see how families would be on TV around Christmas time. And, I thought I always wanted that. It was kind of crazy when I finally did get that. I didn't know how to act. I didn't know how to feel surprised. I didn't know those emotions and things like that because I wasn't used to it. So it was kind of different growing up in that sense. But for the most part, I had a really good childhood. But I moved down to Fresno in about sixth grade, and because of me bouncing around, I got picked on a lot. I had to I got into wrestling to learn how to defend myself because I was always the new kid, so I was an easy target. But yeah, so I got into wrestling. So when came down here to Fresno, well, I actually moved to Clovis, which is kind of like an offshoot of Fresno. It's like the nicer part of town, but yeah, Clovis schools are really known for their sports and their sports programs, and so I jumped into wrestling right when I moved down here, and I became really good at wrestling. I ended up taking a state championship. I did really well throughout, junior high and high school with wrestling. I even played football in high school as well. Did well with that also, and just as any other teenager, I had experimented with weed, and like I said, I was living with my aunt and uncle. The reason for that is, I got tired of being alone a lot, and my mom has seven sisters and two brothers, so 9 siblings. So you can imagine I have a lot of cousins. But they all live down here in Fresno. I would come and visit them every summer, but it just wasn't enough for me. I wanted to be around my cousins and, just be around family and stuff like that. So I decided to make the decision to move down here to Fresno with my aunt and uncle. And it was the aunt and uncle that didn't have any kids. So they'd never had kids before. So it was an interesting experience. I went from not having any rules whatsoever to all of a sudden having all this structure and all these rules. And I wasn't used to that. I thought I wanted that at the time, but it was really hard for me to transition into that. So as you can imagine, I definitely rebelled a lot. I was really tough for my aunt and uncle. Just thinking about what I put them through, I feel really bad, and I love them to death, bless their hearts, but my aunt, I don't think, I think she was kind of sheltered throughout life, she didn't experience a lot like I had. She hadn't seen the world like I had, I'm not saying she didn't experience life. Of course she did. In fact, she was actually a family therapist, a very, very smart lady. But what happened with that was, she tended to start treating me like a patient, which I hated that. I don't think she did it intentionally. I think it just kind of just a natural way about herself, and I love her to death. She was really easy to talk to, but, her kind of treating me like a patient at times kind of, I don't know, it threw me off. I didn't really like that too much. But anywho, like I said, I started rebelling. I started experimenting with weed. They found out that I was smoking weed, and it grounded me, and I felt like I was grounded for like 3 years straight, honestly, because about the time I'd about to get off grounding, I would do something to get myself in trouble again, so I felt like I was stuck in that room for almost 3 years straight, and which sucked because I finally had gotten that group of lifelong friends that I'd always wanted, that you always see on TV, that grew up together and they'd known each other for years, and I finally got that, but I wasn't really able to hang out with them, so I started sneaking out and doing things, that, rebellious teenagers would do, and I always had it in my mind that I'd always do it, I was willing to do anything that was natural that came from the earth. That was my justification for it. So I would do weed, or smoke weed, and I would, try mushrooms. I even dabbled in a little bit with cocaine. I justified it by being, well, it came from a coca plant, which is kind of stupid, but um, especially nowadays, it's so stepped on, and with all the extra chemicals that are in it, it's barely even natural at all anymore. But anywho, that was my outlook on things, at that time in my life. Um, Eventually I ended up moving back in with my mom. She came back down here. She had my little brother at that time. He was 3 years old. I was 16. She moved back down here to Fresno. I moved in with her. Um, and I grew up my whole life, pretty naive towards a lot of things I found out. Because when I moved back in with her, I was sitting at the table with one of my friends, and a gentleman had walked in and went in my mom's room, and they're in there for about 10 minutes with the door shut, and then he left. To me, that was normal program. I'd seen that my whole life, so it just seemed natural. Like I said, it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. My friend leaned over and asked me, he's like, "Is that your mom's drug dealer?" And I was like, "No, of course not." But then I sat there and thought about it, and I was a little more hip to things. I'd been smoking weed, maybe selling a little bit of weed here and there, and so I was a little more hip to things. So I thought about it, and I was like, "What the heck?" So I waited until she got in the shower, and I went and snooped around her room, and sure enough, right underneath the bed, man, I found a mirror with all this powder on it. And at the time, I thought it was cocaine. I didn't know anything about methamphetamines or anything like that. So of course, I scooped a little bit and tried a little bit, and man, it burned so bad. But then, next thing I know, I was cleaning the house and enjoying it. I couldn't sleep for 3 days. Something about it didn't feel right. So I took a little more of it, and I took it to school to a friend that I knew would know more about this stuff. And yeah, he came back out and told me it was not cocaine. He told me it was crank. And I was like, "What's crank?" I had no idea what that stuff was. I didn't know anything about it. And so I did a bunch of research and learned about it and learned what it was. And because of that, I started holding some resentments towards my mom, because I don't know, something about finding that stuff and the smell of it or something, it kicked back all these memories that I had as a childhood. And I'd realized she'd been doing this stuff my whole life. And it kind of hit me like a train. I didn't take that very well. Um, I didn't show that on the outside really, but it was tearing me up on the inside, and I held that in for a lot of years. And I had a lot of resentments towards her, and it affected the way I treated her, and I felt really bad about it. I said a lot of mean things to my mom, that I regret. I've since forgiven her, obviously, um, but I'll get to that more down the road. So anywho, here we are. I'm living with my mom. Find out that she's doing drugs, um, and so God forbid she tell me about me smoking my weed. She wasn't going to tell me anything. So I did whatever I wanted pretty much because of that. But long story short, she ended up going down a pretty dark path. I ended up moving all her stuff into storage. I ended up moving out on my own, at 16, 17 years old, and getting, living with a roommate. He was an older gentleman, and it wasn't really a healthy environment. I was growing weed, and all my friends would come over and we'd party and stuff, and do the natural little rebellious teenager things that teenagers do. Nothing too crazy. Um, but as time went on, my life actually went pretty well. I did good. I got into work. I was working for the family business, which is the restaurant company. They owned a bunch of restaurants, and I got into that. Got into bartending. Loved bartending. Eventually ended up getting married. I had a beautiful daughter. She's 14 years this year. Um, that was the best thing that happened in my life, man. That was, I never knew you could love something so much until I had my daughter. I thought I had a good understanding of what love was until that moment, and it just took it to a whole nother level. It was a magical experience. My daughter was my world, and my wife decided to go back to school. Well, she went back to school, got her master's, and then she decided to go back to work. My daughter was about 2 years old at this time, and our marriage kind of took a turn for the worse. We ended up getting separated and got a divorce. And at first, I'd taken it in stride, but right away after our divorce was final, my ex had decided to get remarried. And I was kind of okay with that. It didn't bother me that she got remarried, but just knowing my daughter had another family, that kind of didn't sit right with me. And come to find out, she got pregnant with this kid, and and finally one of these times when I went to meet up with her to see my daughter, which these meets were getting less and less and less, and it was getting really tough, but hi, I'm starting a brand new podcast called Addiction and Recovery by Wagz Creations. It is a safe place where we can get vulnerable and share our real experiences. Please, this podcast is truly close to my heart. I want us to build a community together. So please follow me and stay updated. And check the link in the description for more. And we did everything outside of the courts. I even used her divorce lawyer. So I had a trust factor with her. We just decided to, do things amongst ourselves, because I mean, she was my best friend, you know what I mean? And there was no, you know, I didn't have any, ill will towards her or anything like that. I still loved her as a person. But yeah, one day when I went and met up with her, we met at Starbucks and she pushed these papers in front of me and wanted me to sign my rights away to my daughter. And it was because, she was about to have his kid and, I know they're about to have their family and she didn't want her to have a different last name than the rest of the kids. So she wanted him to be able to adopt her and have their last name, and as much as I didn't want it and as much as it didn't sit right, I ended up signing those papers. She wasn't taking no for an answer. But I trusted her. She promised me I was always going to be involved as her father, and that obviously wasn't the case. That was the worst thing I'd ever done in my life. I don't try to live my life with regrets, but that's the one regret I do have in my life. The minute I signed those papers, things just got really difficult. Eventually, she blocked me out of my daughter's life, and she may have her reasons. I wasn't using at that time. I was partying with my friends and stuff like that after work and things like that, but nothing crazy. Um, but yeah, I haven't seen my daughter since then, and it's been 12 years now. So it's what eventually beat me. I've been through a lot in life, like I said, and nothing had really gotten me like it got me this time. I took it in stride for a while. I started out drinking a little more heavily, and eventually my drinking got the better of me. And that was the first time that I ended up going into a program, was because of my drinking. I also had a cocaine problem, but I wasn't willing to admit that to myself. And honestly, only reason why I went to this program was just to really reset my mind. I wanted to get back to the old me and just kind of reset things. I wasn't planning on necessarily staying sober. I still wanted to go back to bartending and things like that. So my mindset and the reason why I was going into it was kind of all wrong. But when I got there, I ended up kind of buying into it. I started buying into the meetings and the things that they're saying, and I really kind of enjoyed it. And but when my 30 days came up and for me to go home, my girlfriend didn't want me to come home yet. She wanted me to go into sober living, so I did that. Um, and then it still went well. And then one day she came to visit me on my birthday. We had the best time ever I think we've ever had, and first sober birthday in a really long time. And when she dropped me back off at the sober living place, left me with a Dear John letter breaking up with me, and I lost it. I immediately went down to the store and bought a bottle of alcohol, but I didn't relapse. I came about as close as you could to relapsing, but I went to take a swig of that, and then I looked at the bottle, and I just remember thinking, that this isn't going to fix anything. It's just going to cause more problems. So I ended up throwing that bottle in the bush, and this is a true story. And I was actually really proud of myself. That I didn't make that choice to drink. And so I went back to my sober living house. I was kind of proud of myself. So I told my, house manager at the time, I thought I was doing the right thing, and, like I said, I was really proud of myself. But I went to work that night and then came back home and all my stuff was sitting on the front porch. They said I was putting the house at risk and things like that, which I didn't even do it at the house. So I felt kind of betrayed, honestly. So I really lost my faith in recovery at that time. But I went about my business, carried on. I had still carried on a job and everything. But I went back to drinking a little bit. It wasn't as, I didn't have the obsession wasn't quite there as it was before, but I was still drinking and still partying and still dabbling with cocaine and things. And, really wasn't being honest with myself. And eventually I just really stopped caring. My emotional state was just so bad that I couldn't even hold a job. I never really lost a job, but I never got fired, but I just kept quitting jobs anytime some girl would hurt my feelings or something. It was really stupid. I was a mess. And eventually I ended up, on the streets, and I got introduced to meth, and eventually led down to using, heroin, which eventually led to fentanyl because obviously it got harder and harder to get heroin. So everything switched over to fentanyl. And man, that's just when it got really dark. I was out there on the streets, addicted to fentanyl, a slave to this drug that I really couldn't stand, but it's the only thing that could numb me enough to where I didn't feel that pain. But one day my mom found me out there on the streets, and she sat there and pleaded with me, and begged me. She was afraid I was going to die out there, which I probably would have. And I also started thinking, what if my daughter came to find me and she found me out there like that? Like, how would I feel? And obviously, if I was being honest, I'd be devastated. I don't think I'd be able to handle that. And so it was that moment that I decided to make a change. So I decided to take the opportunity I had to go to LA and go into a program. And I did, man. And everything went great. I went through this recovery process, I had all the support, all these great things happen. I started my own digital marketing company. I put out 2 music albums. All these great things were happening in such a short period of time. I think I had about 90 days under my belt, and I decided to come back to Fresno. Boy, that was a mistake. I immediately relapsed within a day or two. Ended up ODing. I'm very lucky to be here. Um, but I knew immediately that I made a bad decision. And so I decided to make arrangements to come back out to LA, but I couldn't come out till the first of the following month. So I was out there for a month on the streets, still continuously using. In fact, I used harder than I'd ever used before, honestly. But I got back into treatment, and man, this time the withdrawal was so much harder than I remembered the first time. On day 4, I almost walked out. I told the technician that was there that I was done. I couldn't take the pain anymore. I'd been tossing and turning and yelling, and poor thing, she was scared. I was yelling and cussing up in my bed and stuff, and I was just so uncomfortable. I wanted to crawl out of my skin. It was just the worst pain I'd ever felt in my life, and I wanted it to stop. And I only way I knew how was to go use. So I told her I wanted to be discharged. I was gonna figure out a way to get back to Fresno. So she called the owners, and she told me that they wouldn't be able to be there for another hour. So I gave it one last shot, and I went back up to my room and I jumped in the shower and I laid there in the bottom of the shower for about 3 hours. I finally fell asleep, and when I woke up, the pain had subsided. Thank God. I mean, I was just so grateful for that. And I went back downstairs. They asked me if I still wanted to leave, and I said, of course not. I just had to get through that. And I did. I'm glad I stayed. It was a different experience though going to the detox this time, because normally when you go to detox, you have a bunch of people there with you, right? And the first time I went, I had a bunch of people even from Fresno that were with me. This time there were a couple people there, but they ended up going through like 10 clients in the first week I was there, and then after that, nobody. So I was by myself for like 20 days, and that was strange. It was very lonely. I'll be honest, but it did something for me. It allowed me to work on myself from the inside out. It allowed me to learn how to be okay with myself and being with myself and my thoughts, which I was never good at before. Um, so it really benefited me. I turned something negative into a positive. I think it happened for a reason, because it really truly allowed me to really look and dig deep and think about what I truly wanted out of life. And even when I left the detox, things were still rough. I got into sober living, and that first 30 to 60 day mark, I was going through depression. I just wasn't feeling it. I was getting to that feeling where I wanted to go home, but I knew I didn't want my old life. I knew I wanted something better and different. So I kept showing up. I started taking suggestions, started working a program, started going to NA meetings. I'd found an NA home group that I started attending, back when I was in detox, and I continuously started to go to that group, and eventually they voted me in as a trusted servant, became of service. And man, that did wonders for me. And what I learned was, somewhere after that 60-day mark, something changed in me. And I think it was because I started showing up to groups and the meetings, not only with an open mind, but also an open heart. And once I did both of those things, something really changed in me. And, because for a while when I was showing up to meetings, everything just seemed like the same shit over and over. Everything seemed so redundant, and I just wasn't getting a lot out of it. I was just getting tired of it. But then, like I said, that something changed, and I was getting a lot more out of the meetings. When people were sharing, it wasn't seeming like the same stuff over and over. I was finding more similarities and differences, in people's shares. And I found a peace about myself that I'd never really felt before. I'd found peace before, but not like this. I just found this feeling of contentment. Not complacent. There's a big difference. But I felt content with the way my life was going, the choices I was making. Things were starting to fall into place. I was going to school. I'm now in my second month of school. My grades actually just got updated, and I have a 4.0. Go figure. And I'm in the top like 5 percentile of out of 150 students in that criteria. So it's amazing. I'm just really grateful with where my life's going right now. And I couldn't have done it without Narcotics Anonymous. I couldn't have done it without one single thing. You know, it was a multitude of things. You know, I had to really work a program, really listen to what people were telling me. And, you know, and like I said, show up with that open mind and open heart. I think that's really what did it for me. You know, once I was able to do that and figure out how to do that, that's when the change started happening. I know a lot of people call it a spiritual awakening. But yeah, that's just when things really felt different, you know, and I feel a happiness and this joy about myself that, you know, I can't get the smile off my face. It's been stuck in my face for like a month now, and I love it, you know, and, you know, that can be you too. You know, if you're out there still struggling, just know that if you have a willingness to want to change your life, there are people out there willing to help you, you know, and I could be one of those people, you know. I'll definitely leave my number in the description below. So, you know, don't be afraid to call for help. You know, like I said, if you have a willingness to want to change your life, there are a lot of people out there willing to help you, and we can definitely steer you in the right direction. So don't be afraid to call for help. Addiction is a serious issue out there. Um, and this podcast is just my way of trying to give back. So I hope you guys got a little something out of my story. It's kind of the shortened version, you know. I'll talk a little more aspects about that, you know, in different shows and things like that. I'll have different guest stars on here to talk about their experiences and share what they've gone through in life and their recovery process and how it's worked for them, you know, and just try to give you guys tools and, you know, and have a community where you guys can feel welcome and come and hear these shares and hear people talk and just kind of maybe learn and grow from that or feel inspired or, you know, whatever it might do for you. You know, I just hope I can help in some sort, one way or another, you know. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys. I appreciate you guys. Love you to death. Gotta go. You guys go out there and kill it. I know I'm going to. Wags out.